Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Ari Theriger and today I'm going to talk about the Druids, what we truly know about them. Between the lines I have said once in a while that we don't know much about the Druids, and that raised a couple of questions, so I've decided to make a video about it. The information we have about the Druids comes in two forms. It's either almost nothing, or the information is so extensive that indeed we would think that there's really a lot that has survived about this Iron Age Celtic society. The truth is, sadly, that indeed we don't have a lot of information about the Druids, who they truly were and what they did and their purposes. Historically speaking, there's a great gap concerning the Druids. Most of the extensive information we have about them are idealizations and romanticisms that the English and the French have made about the Druids since the 16th century, trying to look for a noble and dignified ancestry that would place both English and French society in historical terms balanced with Greco-Roman civilizations. So what has happened since the 16th century, of the Common Era of course, was the construction of an ideal, imagining Druids as some sort of ecological priests, sages with outstanding wisdom and guardians of fantastical mysteries, almost like prophets, in an attempt to have an historical background that was as admirable as the Greco-Roman past. And these exaggerations have given way to such a vast number of literature on the Druids that we have come to the point that we truly take these fantasies as the historical truth. The fantasies about Druids were even more extended and aggrandized in the 19th century with the development of nationalisms in Europe and the fervent need to find an ancestral past with some dignity, nobility even, always based on the ideals of race and the love of nature. And when something like that wasn't found, it was just created. And this has had a tremendous amount of influence on neo-paganisms of the 19th and the 20th centuries, especially in neo-Druidry, where we find claims of being the continuation and preservation of the ancient wisdom and arts of the Druids, when it actually isn't. And I'm sure many who call themselves Druids these days rely on sources since the 16th century, which seem plausible since they are 500 years old, so people may have known something about it back then. But this is a mistake because, as I've said, such fantasies about historical pasts concerning European countries were being concocted quite early to give a sense of ancestral power, dignity, even the right over people and territories, giving a sense of superiority. The Druids existed during the Iron Age, which for Europe differs quite a lot in time, of course. For instance, the Iron Age for Scandinavia, in a broader sense, begins more or less around 500 before the Common Era, while in the Iberian Peninsula begins more or less at 800 before the Common Era. And when these periods came to an end also differs quite a lot. In Scandinavia, the Iron Age ends around 800 of the Common Era, and in the Iberian Peninsula ends earlier at 200 before the Common Era. But still, I think you got the point that the Iron Age was a long time ago, and concerning Druids we know little. Perhaps I should not have used Scandinavia as an example because we are talking about Druids, but well, that was indeed just an example concerning historical periods and how they differ in Europe concerning geography and cultural developments. The point here is that we don't know much about the Druids, and much of what we think we know is something developed more than 1,000 years after the Druids disappeared. So I think it would be important to make a video about this subject, and well, with no more delay, let's get started, my dear friends, please. Well, we already know that since the 16th century, more fantasies than certainties have been affirmed about the Druids. So it's better to look at the few sources we have that were created at the time the Druids existed. However, these sources are not only very few and short, but also from the point of view of other civilizations that either knew about the Druids only by hearsay, or they had a brief contact with them, but from the point of view of conquerors, with a very different social, political, and religious notion than that of the societies in which the Druids existed. So there are a few elements to build a real image of these priests and sages who were admired by the Greeks and Romans and revered by the Celts. And here's where our first problem resides: the notion of Celts. Claiming that the Druids were part of Celtic culture leads to many common mistakes, and indeed there are several misconceptions about the Celts. The Celts were not a people, the Celts were not an ethnic group. And nowadays this wrong notion is being perpetuated by companies that provide DNA analysis, and their advertisements to lure people in are very misleading because they make this whole propaganda based on people's lack of information and common misconceptions created by nationalism and romanticism of the past. They tell you to do a DNA analysis to find out if you have Celtic ancestry or if you have Viking ancestry and so on and so forth. As it has been discussed here on this channel several times, Vikings were not a people, but a Viking was mostly a seasonal activity which expanded into other activities concerning the history of Nordic Iron Age and Middle Ages. A Viking was a person in a specific seasonal sea-related activity concerning raiding, trading, smuggling, piracy, exploration, settlement, colonization, slavery, etc. A sea-related activity and not an ethnic group. So more or less the same thing with Celts, although it is much more complicated, and in historical terms it has a broader reality and has its roots in a deep cultural reality. When we speak about Celts, the first thing that comes to mind is either a vague idea of some people in Central Europe emerging during the Iron Age, or we are immediately transported to a world of fantasy in the British Isles and Arthurian legends and such. Celts were not an ethnic group. A Celt was a person who spoke a Celtic language or dialect, and whose life was inserted in a Celtic-like culture, meaning art, jewelry, architecture, urban planning of settlements, religion, and entire lifestyle in social, political, military, and religious terms had a lot of cultural similarities. Virtually anyone could be a Celt. It was not about ethnicity, but in fact about adoption of cultural elements. People were not Celts, they became Celts. So the correct way to address this subject is to say that people were Celticized, the same way people have been Romanized, even Christianized, although being Celticized has had more to do with constant contacts through trading rather than through conquering and colonization. And this is probably why many historians and archaeologists to this day can't wrap their heads around certain archaeological findings concerning Celts. I've given this example before. Many people believe the Celts appeared in Central Europe out of thin air, and the Celtic culture developed from there, spreading all over Europe and beyond, or that the great center of Celticism were the British Isles, even though when Celtic cultural influences arrived to the British Isles, many other European territories had been Celtic long before, some of which were already developing into something else and adopting other cultures. And then it gets confusing. when we find entire Celtic cities, Celtic artifacts, architecture and material culture in northern Portugal and in Galicia, northwestern Spain, during the late Bronze Age, before the Celts supposedly appeared in Central Europe. The Celts and their culture was not a development that spontaneously appeared. It was a series of cultural developments from all over Europe, mainly Western Europe, and different peoples with constant contacts with each other that eventually influenced one another, adopting each other's cultures, religions, traditions, and eventually many societies became very similar to one another. They were Celticized over the course of many centuries. So of course we find entire Celtic-like cities and material culture in Western Iberian Peninsula, along the Atlantic and the interior, before the Celts appeared. Because these are cultural factors that influenced other peoples in Europe and vice versa. People were Celticizing each other by adopting several cultural factors. So I repeat, anyone could be a Celt. But does this mean that every Celtic civilization, every Celtic cultural pocket, every Celtic settlement all across Europe and beyond had Druids? No, of course not. There were still differences between many Celts. So I thought this was important to say because this also has a great influence on how we perceive Celts and how we perceive Druids. I'm telling you this because, historically speaking, Druids are mostly referred to as a priestly class among Celtic peoples in what is now modern-day France and the United Kingdom, mostly in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, etc. But does this mean that the Druids were all the same in each Celtic civilization? No, of course not. Classical authors also refer to the existence of Druids in the Iberian Peninsula. The Lusitanians and the Galicians had Druids, which seems perfectly plausible since they were Celtic-like peoples. But did these Druids behave in the same manner and had the same functions as other Druids elsewhere within Celtic societies? No, of course not. The Druids of the Western and the Atlantic Iberian Peninsula seem to have been more like shamans as a general term to designate a spiritual leader, and more like guardians of the ancient stories of the tribe, more like soothsayers and the ancients or the elders of the community, while the Druids of Ireland seem to have been a particular social group, a priestly class within the social and religious structure of the ancient Irish, but an elite group, a lot more detached from the average community, instead of being inserted within the community like the Druids of the Iberian Peninsula. I'm specifically referring to this because one of the sources we have concerning Druids comes from Strabo. Strabo claims that all Celtic groups had their Druids, and Strabo is one of the most important sources for knowing the religions and societies of the pre-Roman Iberian Peninsula, especially along the Atlantic. And he claims that all Celts had Druids, which is a little strange, as we only know of them in Gaul and in the British Isles. However, he is not entirely wrong, but he is not quite right either. There were indeed priestly societies among many Celts, but calling them all Druids leads to a misunderstanding of Druids, as each priestly group among many Celts would have a different designation and function. So let's explore the surviving historical sources and what they tell us of the Druids. Alright, as I said, fantasies about Druids and their secret and mysterious society grew even more during the 19th and the early 20th centuries with the surging of nationalisms in Europe and the romanticisms associated to such political spectrums, always evoking the glory of a colonial past. A considerable amount of historical sources were being concocted, not aiming to unravel the actual historical past, but to seek evidences of a cultural identity and a sense of nation in order to present such evidences as true and valid factors that permitted countries to have right over territories and peoples. Such evidences never existed. The discipline of history was very much a political tool, used only to serve such political ideals, and archaeology back then wasn't better. Archaeology was not a science yet, but instead a hobby of the nobility. It was prestigious to have this occupation, completely amateur, and once again in search of evidences for the same political purposes. And when such evidences were not found, they were created. So many forgeries were also done, which to this day some are still taken as real evidences of material culture, but they are not. The point here is that during the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, the political products constructed by historians and amateur archaeologists found their way into neo-paganisms. Neo-paganism, religious movements, started to sprout and relied very much on fantasies and political lies. And it's in this moment, more or less by the time Wicca was being developed, Wicca being the earliest neo-pagan religious movement, alongside it other New Age religious groups started to emerge. And one of such groups were the neo-pagan Druids, or neo-Druidry, who drew inspiration from Iron Age and Celtic pagan traditions. But the basis of their evidences were filtered through Roman, medieval, and more recent writings since the 16th century by the English and the French, and no small amount of the new histories fabricated during the early 20th century. So Druids gained a new understanding that could fit into the social, religious, and political views of the early 20th century, a product of contemporary society rather than an actual historical figure. The same thing that has happened to the figure of the witch by this period, which I have explained on another video. The figure of the witch became a political tool by the end of the 19th century and was especially used by feminist movements of the time, and more so during the 60s. No doubt that the figure of the witch as a political tool was used for both good and bad things, but the problem here is taking her modern image as the historical truth and completely taking the image of the witch out of context, which creates several misconceptions concerning the history of witches and witchcraft. So the same thing happened with the Druids, completely taken out of context to fit into contemporary views of society. And as such, ancient Druids became political, cultural, and ritual leaders. So let's not forget that historical ignorance and historical misconceptions isn't entirely people's fault. These are social products, and we are always influenced by the time we currently live in and what is understood to be right and wrong, to be moral and amoral. We are all influenced by the politics of our time, the social struggles, the wars, the economy, a variety of social factors that greatly distorts our worldviews and the way we perceive the world. So it is understandable why historical sources and New Age religious movements of the early 20th century were so wrong about the actual historical past concerning paganisms and ancient societies. People were influenced by the current state of affairs of their own period. A collective consciousness inclined to only accept certain social, political, and religious patterns, which prevents people from accepting the truth, when the truth is so different from what we believe to be true. So this goes to all of us living right now at this very moment. Is our perception of the world truly right, or is it the influence of several factors of our current era and societies? What will future generations think of our ways right now? Good, bad, absolute stupidity? Let's not be so quick in judgment, because we must take into consideration the realities of each era. So I guess it's understandable the great amount of fantasies concerning druids and a variety of other subjects. The 20th century was especially hard, and many things changed in a very short period. And these historical fantasies occurring in Europe during that time are the product of the abrupt change of mentalities. Nothing was ever the same after the First World War, and the face of the world was changed forever. And there were more doubts and fears and questions than actual answers. The future was uncertain, and all manner of fantasies were created to hold on to something. So, historically speaking, we do not know much concerning the actual ancient Druids. Much of what we know about them comes from classical civilizations such as Roman and Greek, but also from Christians, who understood Druids as philosophers, but also political and religious leaders. So let's see the actual sources concerning the Druids and how people saw them. The very first mention of Druids comes from Julius Caesar, which gives us a not very detailed description of the Druids in De Bello Gallico, that barely fills an entire page of a normal-sized book. He says the Druids presided over sacred things, undetermined sacred things, and that they were in charge of public and private sacrifices, which is quite vague because we know from several other ancient cultures that even a person within its own domain, a domestic environment, was in charge at least of the private sacrifices, and no need to have a special rank in society. And we also know that certain figures, such as kings, lords, even those concerned with public affairs such as justice and law, could very well preside over the public sacrifices as well. Julius Caesar also explains that the Druids explained their religion, whatever that might have been. So, as you can see, as vague as it can possibly be, which is just opened to interpretation. Another source comes from Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian, which tells us something about the Druids, which is clearly and solely from his own understanding of Greek society. He says that the Druids were devotees of the Pythagorean doctrine, or in other words, the Pythagorean doctrine prevailed among them, among the Druids. And the reason Diodorus presents this concerning the Druids is because the Druids' teachings were concerned with the belief that souls are immortal and live again for a fixed number of years inhabited in another body. So, we understand why he said the Druids were into Pythagoreanism, because one of their beliefs is also shared by the Pythagoreans, which is the belief in the transmigration of the soul. However, this belief was shared among other doctrines and religions in ancient Greece, such as Orphism. So why Diodorus did not compare the Druids and their beliefs with the beliefs within Orphism, and instead made comparisons with Pythagoreanism? Well, this may be our first actual clue. Orphism was a popular religious mysticism, meaning it was a religious mystery for the people, for the mob, whilst Pythagoreanism was not a mysticism, but instead it was a legalism, which was reinforced by a philosophical system with an aristocratic character. So perhaps what Diodorus was trying to explain was that the Druids were a sort of caste from nobility, a particular group of individuals with high social status among the Celts, and thus formed a very restricted doctrine, since Diodorus compares their teachings to those of the Pythagorean doctrine. Another source is Strabo, which I have briefly mentioned before in the the Greek geographer and historian, whose works relied quite a lot on hearsaying and what travelers, soldiers, and merchants had to say about the peoples they encountered outside the Hellenic cultural world. Strabo didn't just say that all Celts had their own Druids, he also said that among the Celts there were generally three classes to whom special honor was given, which were the bards, the vatis, and the druids, and that the latter studied nature and moral philosophy. So these were the basis of comparison from the part of the Greeks, understanding the druids as philosophers, for a lack of better term, and even the lack of an actual understanding of their society. Clearly an understanding that druids were the aristocratic social group among the Celts. Pliny the Elder goes a little further, saying that the druids is the term the Celts call their magicians, so a sort of class of sorcerers, and that mistletoe was understood to be the most sacred thing among druids, as long as it grew from an oak tree, which gives us an understanding that some sacred rituals involved the mistletoe as a sacred plant, perhaps used in special consecrations, as Pliny the Elder clearly states that druids did not use the leaves of an oak, but instead the mistletoe that grew from oaks. He goes as far as to say that the term druids was coined by the Greeks based on the word for oak, which is tris, and as such they were so named druids by the Greeks, precisely by the associations with the oak. But I better put a note down here so we don't waste much time with that particular point. Anyway, it's open to interpretation when Pliny the Elder calls them magicians, as magic in the classical world could be many things. For instance, necromancy for the Greeks was just a term for magic, especially for the act of communication with the dead for prophetic purposes. Or magic could be someone who worked with spells, drugs, and poisons. Pliny the Elder was a Roman of the 1st century of the Common Era, so the idea of magicians here could be anything. So it's quite vague and open to a variety of interpretations. However, perhaps it's important to refer that by the time Pliny the Elder was writing his natural history, the first New Testament texts were being written down, and with them the story of how Magi, bearing gifts from the east, followed a star that led them to the infant Jesus. So the idea of magicians in here by a Roman in a Roman society, it's not understandable or clear how far this was a term already with derogatory implications. We have Hippolytus of Rome, a 2nd, 3rd century Christian theologian, and his contemporary Clement of Alexandria, another Christian theologian and philosopher, and they relate the Druids to Pythagorean doctrines and to divination and magic, and that they were revered by the Celts because they know how to do certain calculations with numbers to be able to prophesizing the future and also practice magical rituals. Clement of Alexandria further explains how Greek philosophy and its origins had its origins among peoples of other cultures, he calls barbarians, and states, and I quote, "And so philosophy, which is of such high quality, flourished in antiquity among the barbarians, illuminating the nations before reaching Greece." And then he goes on to give a number of peoples that had known philosophy, and so they were far superior in their doings. And among these people he mentions the Druids of Gaul. What Clement of Alexandria did was simply to express the importance of philosophy and that it is of such high quality that even barbarians were better just because of having philosophers among them. In the case of Celts, having Druids. Another source comes from Origen of Alexandria, an early Christian scholar of the 2nd, 3rd century, who was a student of Clement of Alexandria, precisely, and he cites the Druids of Gaul among ancient peoples of high wisdom, but only to criticize Celsus, a 2nd century of the Common Era Greek-Roman philosopher and opponent of early Christianity, who often used the Druids as a superior society to that of the Jews, as Celsus was a strong critic of early Christianity, so he praised other cultures, in this case the Druids, as a way of criticizing the Jews and early Christians. For this very reason, the Christian Origen of Alexandria states that the Druids of Brittany worshipped a single god before the arrival of Christianity, and that they taught the people in this way, and that is why the Celts were predisposed since ancient times to receive baptism. As you can see, Origen of Alexandria only uses the Druids to express the qualities of Christianity and completely denies the polytheistic beliefs of the Druids, expressing that they were monotheistic, only to criticize Celsus and show him that he was wrong and that the Druids he adores so much, after all, they were monotheistic. And so if Celsus praises the Druids, then he praises the Christians as well. And on the other hand, Celsus only praised the Druids to criticize the Jews and early Christians. So they were here in a battle of criticism and making stuff up about the Druids only to express how well and right their own religious and political views were. Another source comes from Diogenes Laertius, a Greek philosopher from the 3rd century of the Common Era. He says, and I quote, "The Druids make their pronouncements by means of riddles and dark sayings, teaching that the gods must be worshipped and no evil done and manly behavior maintained." Now, this is virtually how every priestly figure outside the classical world was seen by classical civilizations. Almost every priestly or religious leader figure in several societies were like this, up until the Middle Ages. Most religious leaders in several pagan societies presided over fate, and there were several divinatory arts at their disposal to reveal all manner of future events. We see this among the Germanic peoples and the casting of lots, to reveal the outcome of a battle, or if indeed a battle should be fought. We see this among the Western Slavs, up until the 4th century at least, and the use of horses and the observance of horses' behavior for prophetic purposes, much in the same way the Germanic peoples did. Or the observance and the interpretation of the flight of birds, much in the same way both Greeks and Romans did, and the interpretation of animal and human entrails, as the Lusitanians and Celtiberian peoples did. The point here is that, once again, it's very vague, but at least we understand that the first sources see Druids as aristocratic philosophers, and as Christianity develops in the classical world, the more derogatory representations of Druids we see, which is quite implicit in what Diogenes Laertius says when he expressed dark sayings. But it's also important to take a look at the last part, that Druids taught that manly behavior should be maintained. This is quite curious because it follows the same line of thought as the Roman Tacitus in his Germania and other works of his. You see, both Tacitus in the 1st century and Diogenes Laertius in the 3rd century were not particularly interested in creating a thorough description of the peoples they were describing, but instead they were using vague ideas based on hearsay and gossip and the fantastical tales of travels and soldiers to express their discontent towards their own societies, especially Tacitus, whose work, Germania, contains some historical truth, but the entire work must not be taken at face value, because much of what he wrote is a criticism towards Rome, and he speaks of Germanic peoples in a way he wishes the Romans were, because for him, Romans of his time were losing their virtues and morals. So he picks the Germanic peoples, paints a picture he deems to be suitable for what he believes should be the right conduct, and as such, in certain points, he either elevates or denigrates the Germanic peoples according to the criticism he wanted to express towards his contemporary Romans. And Diogenes Laertius is doing very much the same concerning the Druids. There may be some truth in there, but he was not being impartial. Then we move on to Saint John Chrysostom, around the late 4th century and the early 5th century, a Christian patriarch of Constantinople who said that the Druids concerned themselves with divination and all branches of wisdom. And that's it. Thank you very much, Saint John Chrysostom, who gave us nothing at all. And finally, and perhaps the most important source comes from Ireland, which is a geographical context that actually had Druids. However, the source in question was created long after the Druids were gone. And I must say, I had some difficulties to understand this source, and some point to it to have been created in the 11th century of the Common Era. Other sources point to the 13th century, but most sources affirm that this source was actually composed by the late 14th century. Whichever the case, it was long after the Druids were gone. Be that as it may, I'm talking about an Irish genealogical compilation. I'm not going to try to pronounce this, so instead I'll put it on the screen. And I'll put the stanzas 38, 39 and 40 for you to see, which speaks about the Druid Moira, which is a figure from Irish mythology, appearing in several accounts, some of which place him in Jerusalem. But the likely scenario is that he may have been a local deity or a regional deity of Southern Ireland. And like many deities, powerful figures and legendary heroes, with the passage of time, gained several other connotations and aspects that fit into each historical period and the political and religious tensions. The point here is that this Irish text places the Druid in the story of Herod and John the Baptist, clearly a biblical account, placing the Druid in the character of Herodias, which is the first actual witch attested in medieval Christian literature, whose image became the very figure of the witch woman in medieval Europe, often as a follower of Diana or working for Diana, the goddess Diana, and luring other women into witchcraft and into worshipping the devil. So this Irish source, placing the famous Druid in the role of Herodias, we clearly see how the figure of the Druids was very much distorted by the Irish themselves since they became Christians. And in this work we see the mixture of biblical accounts with Irish history and mythology. The same thing we see in the case of medieval Iceland in the 13th century, the Prose Edda by Snorre Sturluson, and the mixture of Judeo-Christian themes with heathen mythological accounts. But this is not the only Irish source on Druids. However, I wanted to show this one specifically so you can get a sense of the ideas the Christian Irish had concerning Druids and blending it all with Christianity. Because indeed, Irish sources about the Druids were composed by Irish Christian monks. The Irish monks' narratives unfortunately do not give us accurate information about the Druids, because these sources either quickly cut off information about the Druids so as to not offend either Christianity or those who still respected traditional doctrines, or they highlight the anti-Christian side of the Druids to justify their banishment. As we have seen in the previous source, as the famous Irish Druid Mera, takes on the role of the Antichrist. By analyzing the sources we have at our disposal, perhaps we can get an overview of how the Druids were seen in antiquity. Until the time of the Empire, the Druids would have an excellent reputation, normally equated with philosophers and understood as great sages, very wise, but they quickly lost these connotations. And already in the final centuries of the Empire, the Druids were already increasingly understood as a religious class dedicated to superstitions and sorceries. However, I think we can at least conclude that the first impressions of the Druids were that they were highly valued intellectuals, comparable to the sages, wise men, and even philosophers of other peoples. Apparently, the more occult wisdom and teachings of the Druids, and I'm applying here occult in the sense of the teachings that were kept a secret and not in the sense of esotericism. Well, these less known teachings bore similarities to those of the Pythagoreans, apparently. But then again, equating the teachings of the Druids to those of the Pythagoreans may have been a form to express the hierarchy among these societies, implying that the Druids were of the aristocracy, which wouldn't be strange, as we see in other societies. And since this channel has been mostly concerning Old Norse and Scandinavian history, we see this among the Old Norse people. It was usually nobility, royalty even, that would perform the rituals, ceremonies, and public sacrifices. Nobility held a considerable power over the religious sphere. So it wouldn't be strange that the Druids may not have been specifically a priestly class, but rather members of the nobility, a specific elite composed mostly of sons of nobles. And indeed, the Druids may have been a society in which many nobles would have an initiation and being introduced in a variety of subjects to facilitate their rulership over their subjects. Perhaps we can even say that they would have a special wisdom about nature in general, both astronomy and cosmology, and also concerning the realms of both animal kingdom and vegetable. And most likely exercised legal and political functions as well as pedagogical ones, making the Druids a sociological, well-defined priestly class, and in a way strong foundations of Iron Age societies, mainly in Gaul and in the British Isles. Let us not forget that Strabo refers to the Celts as having three classes of men who were specially revered: the bards, bardoi, the vatis or vates, which isn't really specific what they did, because they may have been ogres, oracles, soothsayers, so the best term would be actually diviners. And the other class was the Druids, druidai. So the Druids were really a specific class. But we must bear in mind, as I said earlier, that Strabo claimed that all Celts had Druids. However, at the time of Strabo, there was only knowledge about the Druids of Gaul, because the Druids of the British Isles, we only know of their existence from later documents after their decline or disappearance. And of all other Celts, especially Celtic peoples older than those of the British Isles, we know nothing about, concerning the Druids, of course. So when the earlier sources speak of Druids, they are speaking of a specific class of Celtic societies of Gaul. And this raises an important question. Knowledge of the Druids of the British Isles only appears after these Druids were already in decline or had disappeared. So the term Druid is most likely a construction of classic literature, and the term applied to virtually all priestly classes among several Celts that the Greeks and Romans witnessed. So when Strabo says that all Celts had Druids, most likely he means different priestly classes for each Celtic society, and so these Druids would have different functions according to the society in which they were inserted, and it wouldn't be a unique class with the same standards teachings, criteria, and not having the same doctrines. Druids, as a general term applied by Greco-Roman writers to designate the priestly classes of the Celts, but to the Celts, to each society in different geographical areas, they would not understand their own priestly and oracular classes as Druids, but understood them differently according to the reality of their own societies. Most of the information we have about Druids refers to the Druids of Gaul. So it is very likely that the Druids of the British Isles and other geographical areas of the Celtic cultural world were equated with the Druids of Gaul because they were the only ones with which the classical peoples were more familiar with. But in fact, these Druids from the various Celtic societies of the Iron Age were all very different in their doctrines, teachings, and even in their roles and functions in each society. So what we really know about the Druids is more from the historical point of view of the Druids of Gaul, who seem to have been a strong, cohesive class led by a main Druid, having rules for their election, and I think we can assume that the Druids of Gaul maintained a close relationship with each other. So there were some sort of norms of behavior, a specific set of canons and a doctrine that united them. And the cohesive aspect of their relationships was strengthened and perpetuated during the annual meeting, holding a conclave, a private and exclusive meeting. Therefore, this knowledge about the Druids of Gaul is often widespread and generalized, and it is assumed that other Druids from other places had the same type of doctrine, canons, and the same type of hierarchical structure as those of Gaul. And let's not forget that the vast majority of the sources we have on Druids were written in the Christian period, especially at the end of the Empire and throughout the Middle Ages. In fact, most of the Druids that appeared all over Europe after the disappearance of the Iron Age Druids were Christians, because the term Druid became synonymous with philosopher. So many Christian philosophers called themselves or equated themselves with the term Druid. Therefore, these sources must be studied very carefully and always with a critical thinking, because most sources of the Middle Ages, including those of Ireland, may not be dealing with the Druids of those places, may not be referring to the Druids of the geographical reality the writer is expressing, but simply drawing conclusions based on the earlier classical sources concerning the Druids of Gaul. We must also consider how the general wisdom of the Druids is described, which in the classical world, the Druids were considered priests and theologians, physiologists and cosmologists, even poets and soothsayers, politicians and educators in general. I think there is no doubt that at least the Druids of Gaul were actually priests in charge or of presiding in over sacrifices and ritual, and therefore possessors of knowledge about liturgical symbolism, and also that they were theologians, so they interpreted the doctrines about mythology and expressed characteristics concerning the divine and the ways of worshipping, how people should behave accordingly with the ethical norms based on religious principles. Possibly, they would also have some mastery over a form of writing, which is generally understood to be the Ogham or the Oghamic script, the Ogham that is usually associated with Druids. However, I think this is a good opportunity to say that Julius Caesar said that among the Gauls they used the Greek alphabet, and in fact this is an important reference because it is possible that he is referring to a type of writing system that already existed in the Iberian Peninsula since the Neolithic. which I've mentioned in another video, and it is a type of runiform writing. However, it is not the Germanic runes, but a type of writing quite similar to the Greek and Phoenician, which gave origins to the Latin alphabet and eventually influencing Germanic peoples into creating the runes, but which had earlier origins in the Iberian Peninsula, in the West Atlantic, which is the writing of Alvão. But more on that other video. The Ogham alphabet is often spoken of as a type of script used by the Druids, but this is a very common mistake. In fact, it is even said that Ogham itself was a runiform script. The Ogham system did not exist yet by the time of Julius Caesar, not even by the time of Strabo and even Tacitus. And certainly the Ogham system has nothing to do with runes. You see, since the 17th century, there has been a linguistic, cultural and mythological confusion between Celts, Old Germans and Old Norse. One that still persists is that the Oghamic writing system of the populations of the British Isles would be a form of the runic alphabet. Although some studies point to the influence of runes and Greek writing on the initial formation of Ogham, most epigraphists considered Latin the main model, the result of the contact of British populations with Roman monuments. Oghamic inscriptions were not originally used for magic or divination, and the Druids did not use Germanic runes. The Norse and rune script entered the British Isles after the total disappearance of the ancient Druids. There are a few archaeological examples of runic inscriptions that coexist with Oghamic writing on the same monument, but were made at different times and by different authors, all after the 8th century of the Common Era. But there are also a few examples of runic and Oghamic inscriptions sculpted by the same person, as in the inscription of Killaloe in Ireland, dating to the 11th century of the Common Era. The runes are older than the Ogham. Ogham is in fact an early medieval alphabet, primarily to write the archaic Irish language, which was in use more or less between the 4th and the 6th centuries of the Common Era, mostly of onomastic records, since the contact with Latin. Also used between the 6th and the 9th centuries, the so-called scholastic Ogham, which after the period of Christianization it becomes eminently funerary related. Back to the description of Druids' wisdom. Well, in any case, we have more information about the qualities of the Druids of Gaul and a little bit of Irish to some extent, but there is little certainty about the Briton, Prussian and Welsh Druids. But we must remember about the supposed mathematical knowledge that the Druids had, bringing them closer to the Pythagoreans and hence making them skilled astronomers. But it's important to also say that the Pythagoreans, as an autonomous school in ancient Greece, they disappeared in the 4th century before the Common Era, and there are no evidences whatsoever that before or after such knowledge of the Pythagorean school spread far to the north. The name Pythagorean meant much more a scholar of the occult sciences than a mathematician. The term occult or occult sciences here applied in the sources is very relative, and in ancient literary sources this notion of occult or occult science appears a lot because it is precisely information that was not known or simply people did not have access to. Hence it always became a great mystery, and the Druids often designated as experts of occult sciences. This is because Greeks and Romans could not possibly know about the Druids' knowledge, simply because the Druids did not write them, never wrote them down, did not write their doctrine and knowledge. There was no record of the Druids' knowledge, so this idea of being linked to occult sciences was maintained. The Druids' teachings were purely on oral form. This to tell you that there is no evidence that the Druids mastered any kind of numerical science and mathematics applicable to astronomy. I know what you are thinking. The Coligny calendar, a 2nd century Celtic calendar, but in fact this calendar is little more than a general knowledge of the cycle of the sun and the moon, and is actually much more Roman than Celtic. Or in other words, it seems to be the knowledge of these Celts concerning the cycles of the sun and the moon, but constructed to fit into the Roman format. No doubt that these Celts had knowledge concerning the cycles of the year, the cycles of the sun and the phases of the moon. That type of knowledge is printed all over the Western European megalithic monuments and megalithic religion of the Neolithic. So I don't think this sort of knowledge was simply forgotten by the Iron Age. However, there are no evidences that the Druids had any kind of numerical science and knowledge on mathematics applied to astronomy, as it was assumed simply because they have been equated with the Pythagoreans. The problem here is that if the Druids had any sort of mathematical and numerical knowledge, we don't know what it was. We do not know what the Druids actually knew as astronomers, and whether their knowledge of astronomy would be so extensive as to call them astronomers. This supposed Druids' knowledge of mathematics, numerology, and astronomy are only guesses based on classical sources that equate them with the Pythagoreans. What we truly know about the Druids, especially from archaeological sources, and of course Druids of the Iron Age, British, Gaulish and Irish societies, is that their religions and belief systems were polytheistic and centered around many local deities and shrines. However, most Druids that came after the Iron Age Druids were not polytheistic or anything resembling the little we know about the actual Druids. The majority of later Druids were not polytheistic pagans, but Christians, who assumed that Druid meant philosopher, based on the very dubious classical accounts about the Druids. So the Christians, especially of the British Isles and from modern France, and especially since the 16th century, imagined their Celtic Druid predecessors as philosophers and noble aristocratic teachers of profound wisdom, but never pagan, never related to anything polytheistic, but rather as central pillars of wisdom and political, cultural, and ritual leaders. In other words, Druids, in the Christian mentality, became the same thing as Christian priests saw themselves. So over the centuries until our very day, and especially since the late 19th century, the great majority of Druid orders blended esotericism, fantasy, romanticism, and notions of Druids filtered by classical and medieval figures to create a specific image of the Druids, one that we cannot truly say if it corresponds to the truth in any aspect, because we know very little about the actual ancient Druids. The several modern Druidic orders existing in many countries nowadays are not based on the characteristics and teachings of the Iron Age societies of ancient Druids, because we simply don't know what it was all about. But I don't see that as an actual problem, because we all improvise and we all do what we must. We do what works best for us. And we all try to find something to hold on to, and I think it's actually healthy to explore and find different ways to express ourselves and how we express to others and towards the natural world. The only real problem is taking these modern approaches as long-lasting traditions and the preservation of ancient customs and ways of the Iron Age Druids, which clearly it isn't. And any Druid affirming that it is trying to sell something. There's no problem in how we express ourselves in spiritual and religious terms, and no problem in trying different things to fit in and create a broader contact with a community and with the world. However, we must be careful and understand what we truly know in historical and archaeological terms, scientific terms in general, and what are the modern creations. Because assuming that it is all part of an ancient tradition can lead to several misunderstandings and serious mistakes, which then has the opposite effect on people, which is turning away from these subjects when the fantasy and magic is broken by the truth, which is why many people simply do not accept the truth because it isn't as appealing, or indeed it isn't as magical as we assumed it to be. But I say different. The fact that we don't know much about the Druids, practically nothing actually, maintains the magic and the mystery. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful. Once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.